Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. What I'm going to do today, first of all, is ask you not to prejudge what the topic is and the content because it might sound like, oh, I already know about this. I'm going to walk around Africa today in a different context, a different perspective in a sense. One of the things that we do know about is that, Africa has been exploited. But in particular, we don't have a lot of ways to, if we're in the United States, for an example, to be able to walk back to our roots. Now, we've had the growing thing of the DNA analysis, which gives us some perspectives. And there are some challenges to that, especially because giving up our DNA to entities that we don't control could be a problem. But one of the things I want to do is share some things with you that you can take for yourself and see whether it resonates within you. See, this is what happens. We have within us our total story. We have within us the knowledge already of who we are, where we came from, and all those things. But we have a challenge in recalling it. However, we can feel it. We can feel it. The energies. And I'll give you a good example of what I mean. Virtually everybody I know who has been to Africa, in particular to Gorée Island and the slave points, slavery, the jumping off points for the slave ships. They have all, including myself, talked about the spiritual experience, especially when you talk about the door of no return. It's an amazing thing because your spirit is moved. Mine was. And like I say, everybody I've ever known who's gone through that has talked about that. When we see certain data, certain photographs even drawings or paintings, when we hear music, especially drums, that are African-centered, it resonates within us. So today what I'm going to do is walk us through some areas of Africa in a way that we may not have always seen. And that's why I said the coasts. See, are you from one of the coasts of Africa? I said gold, ivory, pepper, slave, or heroin coast. And I know some of y'all said heroin coast, slave coast, pepper coast. Yeah, it's how we have been dealt with by these Europeans. Because understand, their entry points were the coasts. You can't come into Africa every way because there's some parts of Africa where it's very, very high. And so the ships couldn't get in that way. They had to come to the coast. And they did their work from the coasts. And they named them because of that. Okay? And let me just say clearly, I'll use the term slave, but I'm one of those folks that says, look, they did not take slaves out of Africa. They took people out of Africa and enslaved them. Okay? There's a difference. And I still hear this to this day, people who supposed to know better be saying, well, yeah, they took all these slaves out of Africa. No, they did not. They took artisans and scientists and and teachers, and they took all kinds of African people out of Africa, especially a lot of children out of Africa, and they enslaved them. Okay? And I'm not going to get into this whole thing that some folks are trying to push about the ADOS or whatever, but I do want to point out this. One of the things that is scientifically or historically proven is that no matter what your count is of how many Africans were taken out of Africa, the reality is, as you look at this slave trade map, the reality is that roughly only a half a million came to what is now North America, the United States. Okay? Look, up there at the top says 500,000. Yeah. They were taken to Richmond, New York, Charleston, New Orleans, and even Mexico City. Okay, it was only 500,000. Roughly 300,000 were taken to Europe. Okay? But now, when you look at the West Indies, 4.5 million were taken to the West Indies. That's almost as many that were taken to Brazil. Okay? So between the West Indies and Brazil alone, that's where the majority of Africans were taken. Roughly 9.5 million at least. Okay? So, we should understand that what happened to us? What happened to us? We were all mixed up. We were mixed in and mixed up on purpose. In general, it's been acknowledged that we know about the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast, right? But most of us never heard of the Pepper Coast, and we don't generally deal with the Slave Coast and the Heroin Coast, which I'll get to later on. But where were these places? Where were these places? Okay. Let's start off with the slave coasts. What was called the slave coasts. The slave coast, the section of the coast of the Gulf of Guinea, extending to basically from the Volta River in the west to Lagos in modern Nigeria, or you could also say the Niger Delta in the east, which includes the present-day republics of Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. Okay, you see that there in this graphic right there? Okay. Abuja. Again, when you look at the slave ports, but the majority of those in that area was what they call the slave coast. Now, we're talking about the Germans, the Danes, the French, the Portuguese, the Swedish, and the Spanish. They all made efforts to establish forts and stations in this coastal region, but it became primarily the Dutch and the British. Okay? The slave coast is the name of the areas given to the present Togo, Benin, formerly Dahomey, and western Nigeria. It's a very fertile region of Western Africa along what's called the Bight of Benin. And what we should understand is that Nigeria is the largest population in Africa. Yeah. The most populous country. Now, that just let me say that again. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. What happens is many of us have a limited perception of Africa, and we tend to think of Africa as one place where, it's a bunch of black folks all in these different little territories, but they all do the same. They all live the same. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nigeria is the most populous country, and it was, it's where the Europeans basically had at black folks the most. They were crazy in terms of taking Africans out of Africa. And it became so large, the slave trade became so large in the 18th and 19th centuries that what was known as the Atlantic Community was formed. Africans went to the New World, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean, which I showed you on that map. Ports that exported these Africans include Ouidah, Lagos, Aniho, Little Popo is also called, Grand Popo, Aguirre, Jaquim, Porto Novo, Badagry. That's believed somewhere between 3 and 5 million Africans alone were taken out of that region. And understand what happened. Religions, languages, knowledge were all mixed at that time. See, let me see if I can find this real quick. What would happen was that no matter what village or grouping or nationality or nation within that country you came from, Nigeria is composed of more than 250 ethnic groups. All right? You got the Hausa, the Fulani, Yoruba, Igbo, Ija, Kanuri. Those are some of the major ones. Think about that. Because now we hear about Yoruba. In fact, some of us even follow some of the Yoruba customs or culture, the Fulani, the Igbo. Okay, but they intentionally mixed us up like that. And in Nigeria, approximately half of the country is Muslim, and about 40% is considered to be Christian, and only 10% is considered indigenous. I think it's much higher, the indigenous part. But the fact that it's more Muslim than Christian is a point of contention, because the thing about Nigeria is that it is where they have been taking oil out of there for decades, ruining that country, the land. If you get a chance sometime, go do some research on the oil industry and what it's done to Nigeria. It's criminal. There's some areas in Nigeria where the oil is so thick from spills and just the wastefulness of how they extract the oil that the water basins are just thick with oil. They have fires burning. They have oil fires that have been burning sometimes for years. The children will walk to the place where they have to get their water, and it's just full of oil. It's the sickest thing I ever have seen in terms of the oil extraction. That's in Nigeria. And because it's the largest population, we have a lot of Nigerians who come to the United States. And there's two reasons for that. One is because of the heavy Catholic population over there, missionaries, and they have sized up and groomed many Nigerian children and young people, and when they're considered to be okay in terms of their mental training, then they send them over here. And there are a lot of black people in this country who the only Africans, indigenous Africans they may have ever come in contact with are Nigerians. And they have this perception, I'm talking about the black Americans have this perception that the Nigerians that they have had contact with represent all Africans. Okay? Nothing could be further from the truth. All right? So that was the slave coast. That's what the Europeans called the slave coast, primarily that area, which included Nigeria and the Bight of Africa, Bight of Benin. All right. So let me move to the next area, which was called the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast. Now, why was it called the Gold Coast? Well, it was called the Gold Coast because of the level of gold that was taken out of Africa through that area. Now, it's quite a few of us who have been to the gold, what they call the Gold Coast. We know it today as Ghana. Accra, which is the capital of Ghana, is one of the most traveled to areas of Ghana. Okay. That stamp just kills me. Ghana independence. They put out a stamp. Who did it? The British. You know, West Africa, the white man's grave. That's what that map says, and that's because it was dangerous for them white folks when they went to West Africa. If they went too far into the coast, yeah, they would never be seen again. Now, the west along that area, the west along that coast, is also called the Cape Coast. There's a historic trading castle of the same name. And then there was the Elmina Castle, originally built by the Portuguese in 1482. See, the Portuguese, they get away with really hiding because, first of all, it's a tiny country, right? But when you stop and think about it, the Portuguese are the ones who are primarily responsible for taking Africans out of Africa and taking them to what is now Brazil. And there's 2.5 times as many Africans, people of African descent in Brazil than there is in the United States. It's huge, huge. And how do we know that the Portuguese had everything to do with that? Because the people speak Portuguese. It has Portuguese culture. Yeah, it's just like we think about these Americans. What do we speak? English. Okay, who's our strongest influence? The British. So, yeah. Now, during the Atlantic slave trade, that area was referred to as the Gold Coast because, like I say, it was rich in gold as well as petroleum, sweet crude oil, and natural gas. That's one of the reasons that Ghana is economically strong today. The principal ethnic groups in Ghana are the Akan, which is 45%, the Mole Dagon is 15%, and the Iwe. Now, I put a photo in this grouping, which should come up again, and that's me when I met an actual king from Ghana. And I don't know if you can tell it from the photograph, but my man was wearing some serious gold. And we ain't talking about that kind of cheap gold that, rappers or whatever be trying to wear. This man had gold on it. It was heavy. And it was kind of funny because people didn't realize that that wasn't no play gold. And he literally really is a king. In fact, Ghana is a democracy, but it retains its chieftaincies. The paramount chief of the Lower Axiom Traditional Council is this king right here. His name is King Awule Adebrugusu III. Yeah, that's serious, real gold. That ain't no, ain't no gold that they picked up off the corner. All right. But Ghana, which by the way has had a strong campaign going of return, saying to Africans in the diaspora, you can return here, and they would not only look at you getting citizenship, but also they're urging folks to come over and live there, move there, and start businesses and all of that. Yeah. So it's something to think about. All right. Let's go to this one is kind of interesting to me. Let me make sure I didn't skip over anything. I might have to come back to a little bit more about Nigeria because there's some other things going on in Nigeria. But here's the thing. The Pepper Coast. It's called the Pepper Coast. Later it became known as the Grain Coast as well. The Pepper Coast was the name given by European traders. Okay? And they were called that. It's a east coast on Western Africa between Cape Mercerado and Cape Palmas. Okay? And it is now pretty much the area we call Liberia. The Pepper Coast got its name because of the Malagueta pepper, also known as the grain of paradise, which is where they got the other name, the Grain Coast. I was not familiar with this pepper, but apparently, and I hope I'm saying it right, the Malagueta pepper. And it's a very spicy pepper, and it's used in northern and west coast African cooking. Now, I've understood that since I've checked into this, you can find it in some areas of this country, particularly if they're Africans from Western Africa, and in some Whole Foods apparently. But see, I'm not real crazy about real hot, spicy foods, so I'm not about to try it. However, I do have some friends who, since I've been talking about it, they said they're going to look for it and try it because, they like that hot stuff. Oh, jeez. But the Pepper Coast. So again, you may have some ancestors from there. You see, the reason why I'm doing it this way to see if you can see for yourself or feel for yourself whether or not any of these things resonate within you. Okay, that's how you can tell that there's some ancestry there. Okay, now let's go to what is called the Ivory Coast. The Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, officially called the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, which means ivory. Ivory Coast. It's located on the south coast of West Africa. Now, its capital is, I'm not even going to, well, I'm going to try it, but I'm probably going to not say this correctly, but it's Yamoussoukro. Yamoussoukro. It's in the center of the country, but its economic capital and the largest city is the port city of Abidjan. Now it borders Guinea and Liberia to the west, Burkina Faso and Mali to the north, Ghana to the east, and the Gulf of Guinea in the Atlantic Ocean to the south. The Ivory Coast is the world's largest exporter of cocoa beans, which is a key ingredient in chocolate. Now, here's the deal on this. It's really deep. The world's largest exporter of cocoa beans. Now, there's certain categories of cocoa beans that are used in chocolate. The most used cocoa beans are the ones from the Ivory Coast. But they're also considered they're not considered the highest level of cocoa bean. There's a much better cocoa bean that comes from other places, in South America, for an example. But the mass of the chocolate we eat in the United States is from these cocoa beans that come from the Ivory Coast. In fact, what do you say? Hershey? Yeah, Hershey has made his fortune off of getting these cheap beans, cocoa beans from the Ivory Coast, and convinced us that that's chocolate. Look here, I'm telling y'all, if you get some real chocolate, it's totally different from what they call the milk chocolate that comes out of Hershey's. Yeah. But now, why do they call it the Ivory Coast? They call it that because originally it was the best place to get ivory. And of course, they would get it from elephants. And they damn near killed off the elephant population in Ivory Coast, in that area. And why did they do it? Because, some of y'all know this. The ivory from elephants was considered the best for pianos. Yeah, because it allows the fingers to stick or slip at will. And it's a feel that no other substance can replicate perfectly. Now, for years, they've been using a plastic. But those who are pianists who have played on pianos with ivory, that's why they say tickle the ivories, they'll tell you there's no other substance, there's no plastic that can come anywhere near real ivory on pianos. And when I was very young, and I had an aunt who had a piano that had ivory keys, And then later I was playing with a piano that had plastic. The difference is amazing. They're so much heavier. The ivory keys is so much heavier. But the tragedy is that they killed elephants like crazy to take their tusks to make ivory for pianos in Europe. They had some come to the United States, but the majority were killed for their tusks to make pianos in Europe. And of course, the first Europeans to explore that coast were the Portuguese. Yeah. And like I say, the first trade was gold, ivory, and pepper, and then they went crazy for African people. In fact, you don't find this today, but at one point, they called it the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast because black people were considered gold, and we were considered to be so precious. We were precious as ivory. Yeah. See that? See the Ivory Coast, Gold Coast, Slave Coast? See, they was naming that stuff, right? And they would go after us. Now, the last one, and this is kind of deep too. It's called the East Coast. And it's called the East Coast because it's on the east side of Africa, where you could, all day long, you could look at history and histories of Europeans, and they'll always only center on the west coast of Africa. Hardly any of them mention at all that the east side, or the east coast of Africa, Mozambique, Zanzibar, and Madagascar, they took Africans out of those areas as well. Yes, they did. Tanzania, like I say, Zanzibar Island, Madagascar. See, they try to pretend like they don't know nothing about that area, Mozambique and Madagascar. And one of the things that I'm really still pissed about is how they've made these movies, these animated movies about Madagascar, named them Madagascar, as a matter of fact. And there are millions of children and young people around the world who think Madagascar is full of talking animals, and there's no people there because they don't see no people in the animations. Yeah, that's criminal to me. Because they do the personification to turn animals into talking beings, but you just don't include any human beings at all? Yeah, it's ugly. But in particular, here's what we need to understand. The Eastern Africa, okay? What has happened there is this. There's a country called Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is a country where, and it's technically part of Asia, and it's where the United States has been engaged in the longest war in American history. All right? The longest war in American history. Now, understand something. Before the United States went over there and got involved in the war, another country called Russia was over there fighting in Afghanistan, trying to take over Afghanistan. They fought them for 15 years and couldn't win, and they left. When they left, the United States went and got involved with, Bush and them. But here's something that they don't like to talk about. In Afghanistan, when the Russians were trying to take it over, the CIA helped the quote, freedom fighters, they were called back then, to fight the Russians. And then the CIA pulled up out of Afghanistan and left the freedom fighters high and dry. They were Muslim, and one of the strongest leaders of those folks was a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. That's where a lot of the anger and hatred for the United States came from when with those organizations, and it led to 9/11. Now the United States is over there fighting. They've been fighting the longest war. But here's the other part. In the time that since the United States got involved, the heroin supply in the United States started growing and growing and growing and growing. The heroin addiction had grown so low in the United States. Usage was so low because the last heroin place was the Triangle, Vietnam and Cambodia and all down there, where there was something called the little Vietnam War. Yeah, well, that's how we got the heroin before, came out of that area. Then when the United States left it, then the heroin population sort of dwindled. But now, isn't it amazing? Afghanistan, since the United States got over there, it's poppies. That's what those are right there. Those are poppies. It's where you get opium and heroin. The growth of heroin, of poppies, has exploded. Now, that's not an accident. Just like it's not an accident that the heroin use in the United States has exploded. And when you look at that and you see American soldiers guarding poppy fields, don't believe me, go do the research. It's out there. It shows that the United States has been protecting those farmers and all of that, those folks that are growing the poppies. And then the poppies are turned into opium and heroin. But now, here's the trick. It's producing more of it than ever, right? Something like 320,000 hectares of land is devoted to growing poppies, and it's been increasing every year. Now, here's the problem. The drug traffickers have a unique challenge. With so much heroin being produced, how can they get their product to the lucrative markets of Europe and North America? Let me back up here. Let me show you again this map. Okay, when the map comes back up to Afghanistan, I want you to look at where it is. Okay? Because this is important to understand why I have the heroin coast. See this? See Afghanistan? And you see Iran and Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan, all of that, right? And Afghanistan got all this heroin they need to get to Europe and North America. And the usual smuggling routes, like Central Asia or the Balkans, they're increasingly unstable, both because of conflict and because of better law enforcement. So, what did they decide to do? Well, certain coastlines and governance makes for ideal conditions for drug trafficking. Drugs can be smuggled into Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique with relative ease. Let me say it again. Somalia. What's been happening in Somalia in the last 10, 15 years? Yeah, a lot. See, but they don't talk about this on the news, about how much heroin is going through these areas. South Africa's got some corrupt ports as well, and international trade links. And so even South Africa is a good base for export to the West. Something like 20 to 40 tons of heroin is being smuggled along this route. In Mozambique, as an example, it's one of the reasons they had to push Mugabe out, because Mugabe had been fighting against the drug trade. See, they have us thinking that, oh, he was trying to keep the white farmers from trying to take the white farmers' land. Look, I'm telling you, every time the United States claims something, you need to look into it, because they're probably lying. I bet most of you all watching this right now have never heard anything on the news about heroin coming down through Kenya and Tanzania, Madagascar, and Mozambique. Never heard it, have you? Never saw it on the news. And they keep showing you stuff about Somalia. And Somalia has had, for now over 2 decades, they kept killing off all the leadership. And they keep it in a state of flux. Yeah, so they can keep running that heroin down there. So, my point with that, of course, is that nothing on the surface is as it seems. Now, I'm doing this January 5th, 2020, and right now the United States is in a terrible state. The guy who occupies the Oval Office has just pulled a stunt by having a top military official of Iran killed. That's a straight up aggressive act of war. Think of it like this: if a top U.S. general was killed by another country, the United States would consider that an act of war. So that's what the United States just did. It just killed one of the highest ranking generals in Iran when he was in Iraq with a drone bomb. Killed him and some other folks. In fact, they killed a high-ranking Iraqi general. And then the Trump had the nerve to say, and y'all better not do nothing about it. I'm like, what? But I say that because, again, we cannot believe hardly anything that comes out of the government's mouth, and that particular guy in particular. Because, of course, the rationale is that, oh, yeah, he was getting ready to do a lot of terrible things to Americans. And he's been doing that for a long time. And, of course, the past administration, of course, that being the Obama administration, they didn't do nothing about it. They should have got rid of him. They should have killed him. This whole thing about killing people without arresting them, trial or nothing is some deep stuff. This was what was called a preemptive strike. That's something that Israel started back some years ago, where they said, look, we take out people if we think that they're thinking about doing something. Preemptive strike. Anyway, let me not get in that. But as I close, I want you to Again, I'm going to show you some graphics that will allow you to recall some of what I've talked about today. But I just want you to let it seep into you, and see if it resonates. Anything that resonates, any of the areas resonate within you, because that's where your study should go to find out if you have any closeness to these areas and these people. And that's how you'll be able to decide whether or not you want to be there, go there, explore there, learn about the country, the people, the history, the culture, and become a fuller person. All right? And I thank you for your attention. And I'll just say, as I always do, no justice, no peace, no love, KNOW.